She cracked a joke that had the whole room laughing, until one man stood up and changed everything without saying a word. This isn't just a political moment, it's a powerful lesson in respect, legacy, and the silence that spoke louder than any headline. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. The marble-walled hearing chamber was filled with the usual buzz, clicking pens, murmured conversations, the occasional rustle of paper. Tension hung in the air like fog before a storm. Cameras were rolling, reporters scribbling notes, and social media was already alight with live tweets. It was business as usual, until it wasn't. At the center of it all stood Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Known for her sharp wit and unwavering confidence, Crockett had made a name for herself by taking on some of the most controversial voices in Washington. She wasn't just another lawmaker. She was a force, a rising star, and today she had a point to prove. Directly across from her sat Kash Patel. Former national security official under Donald Trump, Patel was no stranger to controversy or confrontation. His supporters saw him as a fierce defender of conservative values. His critics accused him of undermining institutions. And right now, he was testifying under oath, flanked by legal advisors and flustered aides. Crockett leaned forward, her eyes narrowed, her voice steady. "Mr. Patel," she began, "your testimony today has been colorful, but let's talk about facts." Her words were calculated. The tone was professional at first. But as she pressed him on inconsistencies in his statements about intelligence, briefings, her tone grew more biting. The room seemed to lean in with every exchange. Patel, for his part, remained composed, giving clipped, sometimes evasive answers. But Crockett wasn't letting up. Her questions came fast, precise, deliberate. Then, just when it seemed like the tension couldn't rise any higher, she delivered the line that would echo through the chamber and across the internet. "With logic like that, Mr. Patel," she said with a smirk, pausing just long enough to make sure every microphone caught her, "maybe you should consider a career in stand-up comedy, though I doubt even the open mic crowd would laugh." The impact was instant. The chamber erupted in chuckles and applause from her allies. Even a few staffers stifled grins. It was a clear, verbal win, the kind politicians dream of. A moment made for social media, destined to be clipped and shared, with a "Crockett destroys Patel" headline. But just as the laughter began to swell, the camera shifted. In the back row, just behind the seated observers, a man rose to his feet. He didn't clap. He didn't cheer. He didn't say a single word. He stood silently, slowly, with a presence that seemed to still the air. Tall, dignified, dressed in a dark suit with a subtle American flag pin on his lapel, he looked like someone who belonged in the room, but wasn't trying to be seen. It was Jasmine Crockett's father, and he wasn't smiling. For a moment, no one else noticed. The laughter faded as people began to realize something had shifted. Jasmine, still standing at the podium, caught sight of him. Her face changed, not drastically, not theatrically. But if you watched closely, you saw it. Her shoulders dropped ever so slightly. Her eyes blinked slower. Her confident grin faltered, just for a second. She knew that look. Growing up in Dallas, Jasmine Crockett had been raised by a man of few words, but strong values. A man who had served in the military, then spent decades working in the community. He taught her how to fight for justice, but also when to walk away. He never needed to raise his voice. When he disapproved, he didn't scold. He simply stood still, just like this, letting the weight of his silence say everything. This wasn't just a disagreement about tone. This was a moment of reflection, of contrast, of a daughter realizing that maybe, just maybe, the way she won the argument had cost her something else. Across the chamber, the energy shifted. Laughter turned to whispers. Phones lowered. The reporters in the gallery leaned in, sensing something bigger than a soundbite unfolding. And then, just as quietly, As he had risen, Jasmine's father turned and walked out. No confrontation, no expression of shame or anger. Just a single, simple act that said more than any speech could. Jasmine swallowed hard and continued her line of questioning, but the fire in her voice had cooled. She finished her segment quickly, thanked the committee, and stepped away from the mic. But the moment lingered. Outside the chamber, reporters gathered like bees to honey. "Congresswoman Crockett, any comment on your father's reaction? Was the joke too far? Do you regret your tone?" She didn't respond. Later that night, she tweeted just one sentence. "Sometimes we get the laugh but lose the lesson." That line, quiet, poetic, and deeply personal, sparked a different kind of conversation online. Suddenly, people weren't just talking about her joke. They were talking about respect, public discourse, and the invisible standards we inherit from those who raise us. And as the video of that moment spread, of Jasmine Crockett standing tall, making her point, and then faltering just slightly as her father rose without a word, it became something more than politics. It became a moment about family, about pride, and about how, even in the loudest rooms, the strongest voices are often the ones that say nothing at all. She's not just a politician with a sharp tongue. She's a woman forged by fire, raised in the heart of Texas by a father who taught her that speaking truth to power isn't just a right, it's a duty. Jasmine didn't come from wealth or legacy. She came from grit, determination, and a relentless desire to make the world better than she found it. Before stepping into Congress, she was a civil rights attorney, defending those whose voices were too often ignored. That fight, that fire, never left her. In fact, it became her political signature. In hearings, she's become known for her unfiltered commentary, her razor-sharp questioning, and the kind of viral moments that cable news can't resist. Jasmine Crockett isn't just present, she dominates the room. And on this particular day, she came ready to challenge someone who represented everything she had fought against. Enter Kash Patel, a man with credentials, controversy, and composure. Once a high-ranking aide in the Trump administration, Patel made headlines for his involvement in several national security decisions and his close proximity to power. To his supporters, he's a patriot who stood firm amid political witch hunts. To his critics, he's the face of partisan loyalty, someone who blurred the line between government service and political allegiance. That day, Patel was seated at the witness table, prepared for tough questions. What he may not have been prepared for was the force of Jasmine Crockett. As she grilled him on issues surrounding the mishandling of classified documents and questioned his conflicting statements, the temperature in the room began to rise, and then the jab. "With logic like that, Mr. Patel," she said, tilting her head ever so slightly, "maybe you should consider a career in stand-up comedy, though I doubt even the open mic crowd would laugh." It was a classic Crockett zinger, clever, quick, and devastatingly effective. Her allies chuckled, social media lit up, and the press began preparing their highlight reels. But this moment wasn't just a mic drop, it was also a turning point. Because in that exact moment, one man stood quietly in the back of the room. No applause, no protest, no words. It was Jasmine Crockett's father, a man who, unlike the political players in the room, didn't crave the spotlight. He was a veteran, a community leader, and a father who had watched his daughter rise from courtrooms to Capitol Hill. He was proud, unquestionably so. But he also believed in something older than politics: respect. As he rose, arms crossed, his expression unreadable, it was as though the room itself took a breath. The laughter quieted, the noise faded. People turned to look. The symbolism was undeniable. He didn't need to say a word. To those who didn't know him, it may have seemed like nothing, a man standing up to stretch or shift position. But to Jasmine, it was thunderous, because she had seen that stance before. As a child, when she had crossed a line at home. As a teenager, when she had made a choice he didn't agree with, he never yelled. He never lectured. He just stood and let his presence say everything, and what it said now was simple. You're better than this. Suddenly, the sharp-witted congresswoman, who had just scored a political win, found herself facing something much more personal, a quiet reminder of the values that had shaped her in the first place. This wasn't just about a joke. This wasn't just about Kash Patel, or classified documents, or political theater. This was about character. This was about a father watching his daughter wield incredible power and reminding her that how we use that power matters. That justice and decency are not mutually exclusive. That strength doesn't always have to come with sting. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Crockett, composed as ever, continued the hearing. But there was a new weight behind her words, a new stillness in her eyes. For a woman known for being unshakable, this moment revealed something even more profound. She could feel when she'd crossed a line. Later that night, Jasmine didn't post a victory clip. She didn't retweet praise or revel in the headlines. Instead, she posted one simple sentence. Sometimes we get the laugh, but lose the lesson. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't defensive. It was real. The tweet blew up. Some praised her introspection. Others debated her tone. But what united people on both sides was a recognition of something rare in politics: humility. In a world where politicians double down, Jasmine Crockett took a beat. And all because her father, without uttering a syllable, reminded her of who she was and who she could be. It was no longer just about politics. It was about legacy, about the fine line between wit and wisdom, about how even the most powerful voices sometimes need to be reminded of the quieter truths. And in that moment, one man's silence roared louder than any applause. In a room packed with journalists, politicians, and flashing cameras, her eyes cut through the crowd like radar, locking in on the one figure who truly mattered: her father. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't made a scene. He just stood there, still and silent, with that look, a look Jasmine had known since childhood. And just like that, everything changed. Her confident posture, shoulders square, chin high, wavered. A moment earlier, she had delivered a perfectly timed zinger that sent the room into quiet chuckles and drew smirks from even the most stone-faced committee members. But now, that same smile faltered. Her next line stumbled. And while most in the chamber didn't notice, the cameras did. To millions watching later, it was a moment of vulnerability in the middle of strength, a flicker of real emotion in a world that rarely allows it, because she knew exactly what that look meant. Growing up, Jasmine had learned early on that her father didn't need volume to lead. A military man and later a community mentor, he believed more in presence than punishment. When she brought home good grades, he didn't throw a party. He gave a simple nod and a "well done." When she slipped up, no shouting, no lectures, just a glance. A quiet disappointment that somehow stung more than words ever could. And in that congressional chamber, decades later, she saw that same glance again. Her father's posture was calm, his arms crossed not in defiance, but in principle. It wasn't that he didn't support her, he always had. But to him, respect and dignity weren't negotiable, no matter who was sitting across the table. After the hearing, the media frenzy began. Reporters swarmed her like bees to honey. Microphones stretched toward her face. "Congresswoman Crockett, do you stand by your remarks?" one asked. She nodded. Slowly, still processing. "My responsibility is to question and challenge, especially when the stakes are this high," she said. But her voice was softer now. Her gaze shifted briefly to the back of the room, where her father had once stood, now gone. He hadn't waited for her. He hadn't asked for a conversation. He had simply walked out. That evening, Jasmine went home, not to victory celebrations or Twitter applause, but to silence. No text from her father, no voicemail, just stillness. And in that quiet, she reflected. It wasn't that she regretted questioning Kash Patel. The questions were valid, necessary. But the tone, that was what lingered in her mind. Had she undermined the power of her point by lacing it with sarcasm? Had she made a moment that should have been about accountability instead about attention? Those questions gnawed at her. So she picked up her phone, opened Twitter, and typed 9 words. Sometimes we get the laugh, but lose the lesson. She hit send. The tweet exploded. Within minutes, it was everywhere. Journalists reposted it, pundits debated it. Some praised her honesty, others twisted it as an admission of guilt. But the one thing everyone agreed on was this. Something deeper had happened in that hearing. People speculated wildly. Had her father really disapproved? Was this an internal family disagreement playing out on a national stage? Had Jasmine Crockett, one of the fiercest voices in Congress, just publicly checked herself? Twitter threads dissected every frame of the moment. YouTube reaction channels posted side-by-side clips. One viral TikTok even recreated the moment using dramatic music and slow-motion effects. The narrative was no longer about Patel's testimony or classified documents. It had become something entirely different. It had become a story about values, and in a world addicted to outrage, something about this story felt human. We've all been there. That moment when someone we love, someone who raised us, silently challenges us to reflect. Not because they're against us, but because they believe we can be better. That's what Jasmine's father had done, not with condemnation, but with care. The next morning, Crockett emerged with clarity. She didn't back down. "I will always speak truth to power," she told a local news station. "But I also understand that power comes with responsibility, not just to my constituents, but to the values I carry with me." She paused, then added, "And sometimes, even in the heat of the moment, the people who know us best can see when we drift from who we truly are." It wasn't an apology. It was something more powerful. Accountability without shame. That distinction struck a chord. For some viewers, it reminded them of moments when their own parents, mentors, or teachers had silently corrected their course. For others, it was a rare example of a politician showing emotional intelligence in the middle of a political firestorm. Jasmine Crockett didn't become weaker because of that moment. She became more complete. She reminded people that strength isn't just in the punchline. It's in the pause afterward, in knowing when to speak and when to reflect. And her father? He didn't issue a statement. He didn't go on the news. He didn't post a single word. He didn't have to, because the whole world had already heard him, without him saying a thing. The buzz of media coverage still rang in her ears. News anchors debated her tone. Twitter threads either defended her wit or criticized her professionalism. But none of it mattered more than the weight in her chest, the one placed there by a man who had barely said a thing. She changed out of her congressional suit, put her phone on silent, and did something very few politicians would have done in that moment. She drove to her father's house. No cameras, no staffers, no tweets, just a daughter going to see the man who raised her. The house hadn't changed in years. Same porch light, same creaky step near the door. Jasmine stood outside for a moment before knocking, unsure of what to expect. But when the door opened, her father was already standing there, like he knew she was coming. He didn't smile. He didn't scowl. He simply stepped aside, letting her in. What happened during that conversation was never fully revealed. Jasmine never gave a full play-by-play of their exchange, and her father certainly didn't speak to the press. But when she emerged the next morning, something was different. She had the same confidence, the same fire. But there was a softness behind her words, a quiet strength. And in a brief, heartfelt interview outside her office, she delivered what would become one of her most quoted lines. "I will always challenge misinformation and hold people accountable," she said, looking directly into the cameras. But I also understand that how we fight matters. My father taught me that, not with lectures, but by example. Yesterday he reminded me, without saying a word. There was no apology for confronting Kash Patel. She made it clear that standing up for truth is non-negotiable. But she also made something else clear. There is a difference between being loud and being heard, between speaking the truth and ensuring that truth isn't drowned out by delivery. We can be fierce, she said, and still be respectful. It was a powerful shift. The internet, so often hungry for conflict, responded with something surprising: admiration. The clip of her statement went viral within hours, not because it was combative or controversial, but because it was honest. Comment sections, usually battlegrounds of insults, turned into spaces where people shared their own stories of parents who led with quiet wisdom. Viewers from all political backgrounds chimed in, not just to weigh in on Crockett's comments, but to reflect on their own moments of growth. She didn't have to say it, but she did. One tweet read, "That's leadership." Another said, even some of her critics admitted, "This is the kind of emotional maturity we need in politics." It wasn't about left or right anymore. It was about right and wrong. About the kind of growth we rarely see play out in real time. About a daughter respecting her father's values enough to pause and reflect. About a public figure showing that strength isn't about never being challenged. It's about being willing to learn in public. In a political climate often dominated by ego and stubbornness, Crockett's decision to acknowledge the tone of her words, even while standing firmly by the truth in them, was refreshing. She didn't bend to pressure. She didn't perform remorse. She didn't spin. She simply acknowledged a truth that resonated far beyond politics. Sometimes it's not what you say, it's how you say it. That message reached beyond Capitol Hill. Parents shared the clip with their kids. Educators used it in classroom discussions about character and integrity. Religious leaders quoted her words in Sunday sermons. And somewhere in Texas, a father who never chased the spotlight watched quietly as the world finally saw what he had always seen, that his daughter, for all her strength and fire, still carried the lessons he'd spent a lifetime teaching: respect, restraint, reflection. The moment didn't erase the tension between Jasmine Crockett and Kash Patel. It didn't change political views or policies, but it changed something else, something more meaningful. It reminded people that even in the heat of political battle, there's room for humility. That leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about being willing to grow in front of those who are watching. And in today's world, where the loudest voice often gets the mic, Jasmine Crockett showed that sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that pauses. It was no longer about a joke, or a jab, or even a hearing. It became a story about family, about growth, about the silent strength of a father's example, and the courage it takes to let that example guide you, even when the world is watching. And as Crockett walked away from the press that morning, her head held high, her words still echoing, one thing was certain: this wasn't just a viral moment. It was a teaching moment, one that reminded us all, real leadership listens. And real change starts with reflection. It wasn't because someone got owned in a political showdown. It wasn't because of a shocking revelation, a dramatic walkout, or a heated meltdown. It was because, for once, a moment in politics felt deeply, profoundly human. In a digital world driven by outrage, clickbait, and viral takedowns, it was something rare: authenticity. A daughter caught off guard by a silent gesture. A father quietly living out the values he had taught for decades. And a nation watching not to judge, but to relate. Clips of Jasmine Crockett glancing toward her father mid-hearing flooded social media. Memes didn't mock her, they praised her. TikToks turned the footage into montages about parental influence, intergenerational respect, and the often unspoken power of family. One video, overlaying her voice with soft piano music, was simply titled, "When Dad Doesn't Have to Say a Word." Because in a world where shouting often wins, one man's silence made the loudest statement. He didn't interrupt the hearing. He didn't lecture his daughter in front of cameras. He didn't post a long-winded response on Facebook. He just stood, still, stoic, intentional, and that gesture said everything. It said, "I see you." It said, "You're strong, but remember who you are." It said, "You were raised to fight, but to fight with grace." And Jasmine heard him. She didn't lose her fire that day, far from it. She kept her convictions. She held her ground. But what she gained was something deeper, an understanding that every public act carries private meaning, that the words we use in front of cameras can echo in the lives of those who raised us. That dignity doesn't dilute strength, it sharpens it. In an interview days later, Crockett said, "People think politics is just performance, but for me, it's personal. Every time I speak, I'm carrying my community and my family with me." That realization struck a chord with millions. Suddenly, people weren't talking about whether she won or lost the exchange with Kash Patel. They were talking about character, about how even the strongest leaders have people they answer to, not with obedience, but with respect. And Kash Patel, even he saw the moment for what it was. "I don't mind being roasted," he said in a follow-up media interview. "Politics is tough. I've been in tougher rooms. But that moment, that was powerful. You could tell something bigger was happening. It wasn't about me." That acknowledgement, coming from the very man who had been the target of Crockett's jab, was unexpectedly gracious. And it highlighted something crucial, that even in political battle, there's room for mutual recognition of humanity. Because at its core, this wasn't about a joke, or a political zinger, or even partisanship. It was about integrity. It was about how we carry the people who raised us into every room we walk into, whether that's a courtroom, a boardroom, or the halls of Congress. And it was about the quiet power of love, expressed not in speeches, but in stillness. That's what made it so unforgettable. That's what made it spread like wildfire. Not as a scandal, but as a lesson. Lesson about how influence doesn't always come from volume. Sometimes it comes from restraint. Sometimes it comes from the people who see you not as a politician or a public figure, but simply as their child. People from all walks of life saw themselves in that moment. Fathers who had taught their kids to lead with dignity. Daughters who had made mistakes and been corrected with kindness, not cruelty. Families who knew that love doesn't always need to speak, it just shows up. And that's what Jasmine's father did. He showed up, not to stop her, not to scold her, but to remind her, subtly, powerfully, of the roots she came from. And in doing so, he reminded all of us. Reminded us that public service is still a reflection of personal values. Reminded us that the way we speak matters as much as what we say. Reminded us that, in a world trained to shout, sometimes the wisest move is to stand still. So while political pundits move on to the next headline, and the internet finds its next viral sensation, this moment lingers, not because it shocked us, but because it moved us. And in that rare space, between politics and principle, a father's silence became the loudest message of all. In the end, what started as a joke became a mirror. Not a mirror held up to Kash Patel, or to Jasmine Crockett, but to all of us, challenging us to consider how we speak, how we respond, and how we honor the people who shaped us. Because sometimes, the truest measure of leadership is how we handle correction, especially when it comes from the people who love us most. And that's what made this moment unforgettable. Not just a headline, but a heartbeat, a reminder that no matter how high we rise, we're still someone's child. If this story moved, you don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. What do you think about the moment her father stood up? Was it just a silent protest, or a message we all needed to hear? Let us know in the comments below. And remember, sometimes the strongest, voice is the one that says nothing at all.